In today's session, we're going to be looking at risk management. What exactly is risk management? And risk management is all about managing the risks associated with our organization, right? So let's look at an analogy here with a house, right? So we have our house over here, and we have an attacker on the outside. That's our threat, right? Now, the important thing to remember here about the threat is that it is the potential to do something bad, right? Doesn't mean it's going to happen. It could happen. So just think about that from that perspective, what a threat is, right? Now, in this instance, we have a threat vector, which is the path, the means of getting into our system. And in this instance, the threat vector is our path, right? Our walkway, pavement, leading up to the house, right? In this instance, imagine that the gates was not locked, and somehow our attacker was able to come onto the grounds of the house. Okay, and then the vulnerability is the flaw in our system, right? So the flaw in our house here is the builder built the house with no locks on the doors and the windows, right? So that's our vulnerability. And in the real world, a system may have vulnerabilities either associated with the application, with the operating system, various different aspects of that. Now, when we look at the threat plus the vulnerability, right, we're looking at the impact, right? So what would actually happen if that threat, that attacker was able to expose the vulnerability, which is no lock, break in. So the impact could be that threat, that attacker could steal stuff from our house. And if we were to map this out to the real world, like a server or something, the attacker may actually use the vulnerability, and the impact could be data leakage or bringing down the system. Okay, and then the other aspect that we really want to look at here is the likelihood of this happening, right? And if we look at an analogy here, the likelihood of this happening may be that it may be pretty, that it may be able to walk in through the door. So that's the high likelihood, right? So it may be, and if the house was located in a major city, intersections and everything, then the likelihood may be more. Or one could even argue that if the house was located in the countryside, the likelihood may be a little bit less. I'm not sure, but you can measure it in various different ways. And when you look at risk management in general, you're really looking at it from either a quantitative perspective, where you're using numbers and hard metrics, or you're using it from a qualitative perspective, which is more subjective. Okay, so like I said, right, the likelihood is, it depends on a number of different variables here. But when we look at risk, it's essentially the impact and the likelihood, and really the actual impact is the combination of the threat and the vulnerability. Okay, now something else to kind of keep in mind here is, when we come to risk management, is how do we address this, right? So there's a number of different ways we can address this here. So first of all, there is the actual risk mitigation, right? So we can actually mitigate the risk. We can put security controls in place. So in this instance, that would actually mean putting locks on the doors, right? Or we would be patching the software, we will be removing the threat vectors, the path, right? We would be putting a gate. There's ways we can mitigate the actual risk here, right? And sometimes, we could just simply accept the risk, right? So in this instance, if only only the windows didn't have a lock on the upstairs floor, then we could say, what's the likelihood, that the attacker may actually, bring a ladder with him, right, to go. So we may just say we accept it because, that the likelihood is pretty less, right? But the impact is still there, right? Or we can just simply do risk avoidance, right? So we can just avoid the risk by putting something in or changing something. Or we can just simply transfer the risk, right? Risk transference, right? For example, have insurance in place for the house, right? Transfer that risk over to the insurance company, right? But there's ways we can address the whole risk, and that's again comes back to the topic of risk management. And then the last bit that I want to just hit upon is residual risk, right? So that's really the risk that's left over. So if we were to do risk mitigation here, and we put security controls in our software, And in this house example, that if we did put the locks in from the upstairs windows, on the downstairs windows, the doors, we fully locked it up, right? What's the residual risk, right? So the residual risk may be that there may be, some forms of other ways of breaking in there, right? So something left over, and that's really what a residual risk is, right? And that concludes today's session. Thank you.